Have you ever wondered what happens when an army that's never been defeated on their own ground faces soldiers who've been told they're invincible? What it takes to turn a jungle fortress into a graveyard? What happens when underground warfare meets industrial firepower and both sides refuse to yield? Private First Class James Jimmy Castellano, just 20 years old from Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, felt the tropical heat pressing against his skin like a wet towel as the Huey descended toward the EBV landing zone. He'd grown up on stories about the Big Red One, the First Infantry Division, from his uncle who'd fought in Europe. Uncle Sal always said the same thing: "The Big Red One doesn't break." Jimmy had that phrase running through his head as he watched the triple canopy jungle rise up to meet them. In his breast pocket, wrapped in plastic, was a photograph of Angela Moretti, his girl back home. She was smiling in front of Coney Island, her dark hair catching the sunlight. He'd promised her he'd come back. He'd promised his mother the same thing at the airport, watching her cry into his father's shoulder. Now, descending into the Iron Triangle in January 1967, those promises felt heavier than his pack. If you're watching this, you recognize that military history isn't just about tactics and technology. It's about the men who executed those missions under impossible conditions. This channel exists to tell their stories with the accuracy and respect they deserve, without glorifying war or simplifying the choices they faced. The Iron Triangle wasn't just terrain. It was a test of will, endurance, and courage that would leave marks on everyone who entered. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let these experiences fade into footnotes.
The Iron Triangle had earned its reputation through blood. 20 miles north of Saigon, bounded by the Saigon River to the southwest and the Tin River to the east, this 60-square-mile pocket of dense jungle and rice paddies had been communist-controlled territory since the war against the French. By early 1967, it housed supply depots, hospitals, training camps, and headquarters for Viet Cong operations throughout the region. The Americans knew about the tunnels. Some intelligence reports suggested over 200 miles of interconnected passages. But knowing about them and clearing them were two entirely different problems. Operation Cedar Falls was designed to solve that problem with overwhelming force. 30,000 American and South Vietnamese troops conducting the largest operation of the war to date. For the North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong fighters defending the Triangle, confidence came from history and geography. Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Thia commanded a reinforced company responsible for defending a sector near Ben Suc village. At 28, he'd been fighting since he was a teenager, first against the French, then against Diem's forces, now against the Americans. He'd watched the French bring their armor and artillery into similar terrain and learned how the jungle could swallow conventional military power. The tunnels beneath his feet weren't just hiding places. They were a complete underground infrastructure with hospitals, ammunition storage, command posts, living quarters. His men could disappear into the earth in seconds, emerge behind enemy positions, strike, and vanish again. They'd done it dozens of times. The Americans might have helicopters and bombers, but Thieu's fighters had something more valuable. They knew every trail, every tunnel entrance, every kill zone. They weren't wrong to believe they could bleed the Big Red One until it retreated, just like every other force that had tried to hold the Triangle. Jimmy Castellano didn't know any of this when his boots hit the red dirt on January 17th. He knew what his sergeants had told him: stay alert, watch for booby traps, keep your intervals. He'd been in country for 6 weeks, long enough to understand that Vietnam wasn't like the movies, but not long enough to trust his instincts. The other guys in his squad were a mix, some short-timers with hard eyes and efficient movements, some FNGs like him still figuring out how to move through the jungle without making noise. His squad leader, Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb from Birmingham, Alabama, had 2 tours under his belt and a reputation for bringing his men home. Webb had pulled Jimmy aside before the insertion. "Keep that picture of your girl close, Castellano. but keep your head closer. This ain't Brooklyn. The ground here wants to kill you." Jimmy had nodded, checked his M16 for the 10th time, and tried to remember every word from training. He believed, with the certainty of youth and inexperience, that his training would be enough, that the Big Red One's reputation would matter, that he'd be home by Christmas. The first thing Jimmy felt was the earth itself betraying him. He'd been walking point behind Sergeant Webb when his boot landed on what looked like solid ground. The sensation of the bamboo mat giving way beneath his weight arrived a fraction of a second before his brain could process it. That terrible moment when balance becomes gravity, and there's nothing to grab. He twisted sideways, throwing his weight backward, and felt hands yanking him by the web gear. The punji pit yawned open where his foot had been, sharpened bamboo stakes smeared with excrement, waiting in a hole 4 feet deep. He landed hard on his back, air slamming out of his lungs, staring up at the canopy while his heart tried to punch through his ribcage. Then the jungle exploded with sound. The crack of AK-47s came from 3 directions at once, a crescendo that built from single shots to sustained automatic fire in less than 2 seconds. Rounds snapped through the air with that distinctive supersonic crack pop that meant they were close, inches close. Jimmy rolled into the nearest cover, a termite mound that barely concealed his torso, his hands shaking so badly he could barely flip his selector to semi-auto. He saw Specialist Torres go down 20 feet to his left, saw the red mist, and knew immediately it was bad. The radio operator, PFC Anderson, was screaming into the handset, calling for medevac, his voice climbing into registers Jimmy didn't know a human voice could reach. Through the chaos, Jimmy caught glimpses of the enemy, not the shadowy figures from training films, but real men with real faces. A VC fighter in a worn green uniform darting between trees, another one crawling through elephant grass so smoothly he looked like he was swimming. They moved like they owned the jungle, because they did. Every crack of vegetation, every shift in the light seemed to conceal another shooter. The smell hit him next, cordite from the gunfire mixing with the wet earth smell of the jungle and something else. The coppery tang of blood and the acrid bite of burning gunpowder that coated the back of his throat. He could taste it when he tried to breathe, that metallic flavor mixing with his own fear sweat. Sergeant Webb was firing controlled bursts, his voice cutting through the noise. "Sectors! Watch your sectors! They're trying to flank left!" Jimmy forced himself to focus, to remember his training, to breathe. He acquired a target, a muzzle flash from behind a fallen log, and squeezed the trigger. The M16 bucked against his shoulder. He had no idea if he'd hit anything. Fire, move, cover. The fundamentals felt like they'd been programmed into his muscles by some other person in some other life. 50 meters away, in a spider hole concealed by vegetation, Private Nguyen Duc Minh of the Viet Cong changed magazines with practiced efficiency. At 19, almost the same age as Jimmy, Minh had been fighting for 2 years. He'd grown up in a village the Americans had burned, had watched his father die from napalm burns when he was 16. The tunnels beneath him connected to a network that stretched for miles, exits marked by subtle signs that only his unit knew. His squad leader had given clear orders: inflict maximum casualties, then withdraw underground. They weren't trying to hold ground, they were trying to make the Americans bleed for every meter. Minh sighted on an American soldier fumbling with his medical bag, squeezed the trigger, watched the man drop. He felt nothing. This was work. This was survival. This was what the jungle demanded. The firefight lasted 11 minutes. For Jimmy, it felt like hours. When the shooting finally tapered off, when the enemy melted back into the jungle as quickly as they'd appeared, Jimmy realized he was soaked in sweat and someone else's blood. Torres was dead. Anderson had taken shrapnel in the leg. 2 other guys were wounded, and Jimmy was alive, his photograph of Angela still in his pocket, though the plastic wrapper was cracked and dirt was smearing her smile. That was day 1. They'd moved 500 meters into the Iron Triangle, and already the jungle had shown them what it could do. Jimmy understood then what Sergeant Webb had meant. The ground did want to kill him, and it had 30,000 ways to try. While Jimmy's squad dug fighting positions and treated their wounded, the larger operation ground forward with industrial inevitability. B-52 strikes pounded suspected tunnel entrances. Artillery batteries fired harassment and interdiction missions around the clock. Roam plows, massive bulldozers with reinforced blades, began clearing thousands of acres of jungle, stripping away the canopy to expose tunnel entrances and cache sites. The sheer scale of Cedar Falls was unprecedented. Entire villages relocated, whole swaths of terrain designated free fire zones, but the tunnels remained. And inside those tunnels, the communist forces watched, waited, and adapted. They'd survived French artillery. They'd survived American bombs. They'd learned that industrial warfare could destroy the surface, but couldn't reach the depths where they lived, planned, and prepared their next strike. The question wasn't whether the Americans could bring overwhelming firepower. The question was whether firepower alone could defeat an enemy who'd built their entire tactical doctrine around surviving it. On the fourth day, everything changed for Jimmy when his platoon got the mission. Tunnel clearance. The big operations, the bombing runs, the roam plows were clearing terrain, but someone had to go underground to clear the tunnels themselves. The Army had started training volunteers called tunnel rats specifically for this nightmare work. Jimmy's platoon had two, Specialist Danny Kovach from Pittsburgh and PFC Marcus Johnson from Louisiana. Neither man weighed more than 140 pounds. Both had volunteered for the worst job in Vietnam. Jimmy watched them prepare with something between awe and horror. They stripped down to basics: pistol, flashlight, knife. No rifle, too long for the confined spaces. No grenades, too dangerous in the enclosed tunnels. Just a .45 caliber pistol, a flashlight that might or might not work, and whatever courage or insanity it took to crawl into a hole in the ground where the enemy was waiting in the dark. The tunnel entrance was barely 2 feet wide, concealed under roots and vegetation. Kovach went in first, his flashlight beam disappearing into the earth like a candle being swallowed by darkness. The platoon set up security around the entrance, and Jimmy found himself staring at that black hole, imagining what it must be like down there. The claustrophobia, the heat, the possibility of a VC fighter waiting around every turn with a knife or a pistol of his own. Underground, Kovach crawled through passages barely wide enough for his shoulders. The air was thick and stale, the darkness absolute beyond his flashlight beam. He'd gone maybe 30 feet when he heard movement ahead. His light caught a glimpse of black fabric, a face turning toward him. He fired twice, the muzzle flash blinding in the confined space, the concussion slamming his eardrums. The figure disappeared. Kovach didn't know if he'd hit him or if the man had retreated deeper. He marked the location and backed out, his heart hammering, his hands shaking. What Kovach didn't know was that he'd wounded Private Min, the same VC fighter who'd engaged Jimmy's squad on day one. The bullet had caught Min in the shoulder, spinning him around in the tunnel. Min had crawled backward through passages he knew by heart, emerging in a hospital chamber where medics worked by candlelight. The wound wasn't fatal, but Min's war was over. As they treated him, he could hear the Americans above, their boots thundering on the jungle floor, their voices calling coordinates. The tunnels that had protected him were being mapped, marked, and destroyed one chamber at a time. The tunnel rats worked for 3 days straight. They found weapons caches, medical supplies, documents, living quarters. They found escape routes and command posts. And they found VC fighters who refused to surrender, who fought in the dark with knives and bare hands, who died defending tunnels they'd spent years building. It was brutal, intimate warfare, the kind where you could see your enemy's face in the seconds before one of you died. For the first time, the Big Red One wasn't just applying firepower. They were adapting to the enemy's battlefield, fighting on the enemy's terms, and proving that American soldiers could match the VC's determination meter by meter, tunnel by tunnel. The phrase that Sergeant Webb had been repeating to the platoon started to make sense to Jimmy. The Big Red One doesn't break. It wasn't about being unbeatable. It was about refusing to quit when everything in your body screamed to run. Operation Cedar Falls officially ended on January 26, 1967. The statistics told one story: 590 Viet Cong killed, over 500 detained, massive quantities of weapons and supplies captured or destroyed, tunnel complexes neutralized across 60 square miles. Ben Suk village, the communist stronghold at the heart of the triangle, had been completely evacuated. 6,000 civilians relocated, the village razed to prevent its use as a VC base. But the ground told a different story. The Big Red One had paid for every meter. 72 American soldiers killed, over 300 wounded. Jimmy's platoon had lost 8 men dead, 14 wounded. Sergeant Webb had taken shrapnel from a booby trap on day 7 and been medevaced out. The photograph of Angela that Jimmy carried was now stained with mud, sweat, and blood, from when he'd helped load Torres into a body bag. The plastic wrapper was torn, water damage blurring her smile, but he couldn't bring himself to replace it. That picture had been with him through every firefight, every tunnel entrance, every night when the jungle came alive with movement and terror. On the communist side, Senior Lieutenant Thieu had withdrawn his surviving fighters to Cambodia, just across the border. He'd lost 38 men from his company. The tunnels his unit had defended for years were collapsed, flooded, or blown shut with demolition charges. The supply caches they'd protected were captured or destroyed. And yet, as Thieu sat in a temporary camp across the border, he knew something the Americans didn't. The tunnels could be rebuilt. The caches could be restocked. The war would continue because the will to fight remained intact. What both men recognized, in their own ways, was professional competence. Jimmy had watched VC fighters execute ambushes with precision that would have impressed his instructors at Fort Benning. He'd seen them fight with a determination that went beyond ideology. They were defending their ground with skill and courage that demanded respect, even as he tried to kill them. Thieu, for his part, had developed a grudging admiration for the American tunnel rats who'd crawled into his prepared killing zones and survived, for the infantrymen who'd adapted to jungle warfare faster than the French ever had, for soldiers who kept advancing even when the jungle tore them apart. The Iron Triangle had been cleared, at least temporarily. Within months, communist forces would begin filtering back, rebuilding what had been destroyed. But for the men of the Big Red One who'd fought there, something had been proven. They'd faced an enemy that everyone said was unbeatable on their own ground, and they'd refused to break. Not because they were invincible, but because they were professional soldiers who did their jobs under impossible conditions. The tactical decisions made that day echo through military history. If you have experience with similar situations or served in Vietnam, the comment section is open. Veterans and history enthusiasts, your perspective matters here. 72 American names were added to the casualty lists during Cedar Falls. Behind each number was a story. PFC Michael Torres from El Paso, who'd been saving money to buy his parents a house. Specialist Danny Kovac, the tunnel rat who'd survived 3 days underground only to step on a mine on the last day of the operation. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes from Atlanta, 22 years old, killed directing artillery fire onto his own position when his platoon was overrun. These weren't statistics. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. They were men who'd believed in something enough to put on a uniform and walk into hell. On the other side, the numbers were harder to verify but no less real. 590 confirmed Viet Cong killed. But that number didn't capture the wounded who died in jungle hospitals, the fighters buried in unmarked graves, the civilians caught in the crossfire. Private Nguyen Duc Minh survived his shoulder wound but would carry American shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life. His squad leader, killed in a B-52 strike, left behind a wife and 3 children in a village near Hanoi. The tunnels that had taken years to construct, the work of thousands of laborers working with hand tools, were obliterated in days. The battlefield after Cedar Falls looked like the surface of the moon. Craters overlapped craters where the B-52s had struck. The jungle that had been triple canopy vegetation was reduced to shattered stumps and scorched earth in huge swaths where the roam plows had worked. Unexploded ordnance littered the ground, cluster bomblets, mortar rounds, grenades. The air smelled of burnt powder, decaying vegetation, and death. Jimmy walked through the remains of a tunnel complex on the last day, staring at the collapsed chambers where men had lived and fought. He found a photograph in the rubble, a Vietnamese woman holding a baby, smiling at the camera, someone's wife, someone's child. He picked it up, looked at it, and then carefully placed it on a relatively clean spot of ground. Somewhere, a VC fighter was carrying a photograph just like his picture of Angela. Somewhere, that fighter was wondering if he'd make it home. The jungle would reclaim all of this eventually, but the cost, the human cost paid by men on both sides, would remain. Jimmy Castellano came home to Brooklyn in November 1968, 11 months after Cedar Falls ended. Angela was waiting at the airport, exactly like she'd promised. But the man who stepped off that plane wasn't the 20-year-old kid who'd left. He was quieter, harder. He'd wake up at 3 in the morning from nightmares about tunnel entrances and punji pits. He'd startle at car backfires. The photograph of Angela that he'd carried through the Iron Triangle sat in a drawer for 40 years before he could look at it again. He worked construction, married Angela, raised 2 daughters. He didn't talk about Vietnam for decades. What was there to say? That he'd done his job? That he'd survived when better men hadn't? That the courage he'd seen from men like Sergeant Webb and Danny Kovacs had been real, even if the strategic purpose had been unclear? The Big Red One had cleared the Iron Triangle. Within 6 months, communist forces were operating there again. The tactical victory had been real. The strategic outcome had been something else entirely. Here's what matters, what Jimmy eventually came to understand after years of wrestling with his service. The men of the First Infantry Division at Cedar Falls served with honor, skill, and courage. They executed an impossible mission under brutal conditions. They adapted. They persevered. They refused to break. The fault, the strategic failure, wasn't theirs. It belonged to the policymakers who committed them to a war without achievable objectives, who measured success in body counts and terrain held temporarily, who asked soldiers to fight and die for ground that would be surrendered months later. The soldiers did their part. They always do. On the other side, fighters like Nguyen Van Thieu and Nguyen Duc Minh served with equal courage defending what they saw as their homeland against foreign invasion. Minh survived the war, eventually becoming a teacher in a reunified Vietnam. He carried American shrapnel in his shoulder until he died in 2006. Thieu rose to the rank of colonel, survived 3 more years of war, and spent the rest of his life wrestling with the same questions Jimmy faced. What had been the cost, and what had it accomplished? War creates heroes and tragedies on all sides. The men who fought in the Iron Triangle, American and Vietnamese alike, demonstrated courage, skill, and endurance that deserves recognition regardless of which flag they served. Their service was real. Their sacrifice was real. The fact that the war ended inconclusively doesn't diminish what they endured or how they served. If you're watching this, you understand that remembering these stories matters, not to glorify war, but to honor the men who fought it. Subscribe and join those who refuse to let their experiences disappear into footnotes. Share this with someone who served, someone who needs to know that their service mattered, that their courage was real, that history won't forget them. The Big Red One doesn't break. Neither does the truth about what they faced and what they accomplished in the Iron Triangle in January 1967.